Welcome back. This is our second video on ADHD and executive function. Alicia Braschi and I are here today, and we're sharing with Montessori teachers the knowledge that we've gained over careers in working with children, mine in being in a Montessori school, Alicia being a neuro school psychologist. In this video, we will cover the criteria for inattentive symptoms, hyperactivity, what the day-to-day performance looks like for the child, the emotional maturity of a child that has ADHD. So Alicia's going to start with the criteria for inattention, and the child needs to meet 6 out of 9.
6 out of 9 symptoms. So as we mentioned previously in the video, there's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder has 3 subtypes. The first subtype is inattentive presentation. And the inattentive presentation has a list. It's of just symptoms. And if you look at really the list, often having difficulty paying close attention to details, difficulty sustaining attention, having difficulty listening to who's speaking to them, difficulty following through on instructions. Well, we all do that, which is where that myth comes from, like, well, aren't we all ADHD? But what's really important, it has to be significantly impacting performance and very different from the development of other children. So yes, it's symptom-based, but again, we all have a little bit of this. So we have to see, are these 6 out of 9 symptoms interfering with their ability to perform in school, but also in life too? You can't be ADHD in math, but no other place.
Right. And the inattentive symptoms typically are little girls in your classrooms.
Typically.
Not always, but typically.
Yeah.
It can be the child that is daydreamy, that isn't getting their work done, is easily forgetful, is distracted. Yes, doesn't know where things are. Yeah. And I know we can all think about, I have a child in my classroom that has those criteria. But I think the piece is that the child needs to be impaired in every area of their life, not just in the school environment, and how it presents itself.
And then you have those wonderful little hyperactive, impulsive children. They're so creative.
So I have one of those children. I live with one. I mentioned him a little earlier. His name is Aiden, and he was diagnosed at 2.5, and now he's 15. But the hyperactivity and the impulsivity is exhausting for teachers and parents. But the DSM guide has the criteria. So they have to have 6 out of 9 of these. So they're fidgeting with their hands or feet. They're squirming. 2, they're leaving their seat in their classrooms or in other situation in which remaining seated is expected. They run around, they climb excessively.
They're the Energizer
They
Bunny.
are the Energizer Bunny. They have difficulty playing or engaging in quiet leisure time activities. So typically they're very loud. They're on the go, like they're driven by a motor. They talk excessively all day long.
You always know where they are in the classroom.
They
don't blend into the woodwork at all.
No, they blurt the answers out when you're in small groups, even before you've completed the question. They cannot wait their turns, and they interrupt and intrude on other friends.
That's right.
Other social development.
And they have to have 6 out of 9 symptoms. Now, sometimes students have both, where they're very hyperactive impulsive, but they're also very inattentive. And that's the third subtype. The third subtype is a mixed presentation, where they're both hyperactive impulsive and inattentive. And again, those are students that are very obvious. You see them, you know where they are in the classroom or in the community. So there's some other components that are really important, that because we learned in the previous segment that it is genetic. they're born with this, or sometimes you can acquire it if there was a head injury, or like a bicycle accident, or near drowning. Those are things that you can acquire attention deficit disorder because of a brain insult. But most of them, this is something that has been seen from a very young age. It may not meet criteria until they're older because it is developmental, and they may, be close to where their peers are when they're 3 or they're 4. But by the time they're 9, they may be very different than their peers.
There's an immaturity level. I think the other piece with that is really interesting is when you are looking at these children in the classroom, they're perplexing. You're just like, what's going on with with this child or these children? So,
and it has to be, you can't, exclusionary factors, like if they have intellectual disabilities, or if they're highly gifted. Sometimes highly gifted kids can look very they have an attention deficit disorder because they're thinking about quantum physics, and you're trying to teach them their letters, right? So that's not ADHD, that's highly gifted children, which is going to be another presentation that we do about giftedness.
And these kiddos that have the ADHD are intense.
They are intense.
They are intense.
Yep. And they're brilliant.
Yes, they are. Alicia calls it the superpower. I love when you say to a child, your brain is like a Ferrari, and the rest of us are Toyotas. And that's what happens with those children. I don't know how many meetings we sat in where, as we're going through what's occurring with the child and our observations, that one parent says, that was me when I was a child, and that genetic component can't be underscored enough.
It's actually part of our assessment, is we look at genetic predispositions for all disabilities, but definitely ADHD as well. And there is a severity level. There's very mild issues, and there's moderate, and there's severe. So we have to look at that. There's also, just to go back to the disorders, some disorders like autism spectrum disorder, which we'll talk about as well, attention deficits are often part and parcel to that disorder, and they go together because it's just part of autism.
And also the spectrum, we talked about that my little guy was way over here on the spectrum, but that's something that
and
you
interventions
can figure out,
are very
and
different.
they worked, yes, and interventions worked. Okay. So the executive dysfunction, so children have difficulty concentrating, they're impulsive, they can also procrastinate because they're very interest driven, so they're very happy doing what they like to do, but when they need to then do what they need to get done, it's hard. They have poor judgment. They'll do things and then they just feel very badly that the outcome was the outcome.
Yeah. I just told you not to pick that up, and you just picked it up.
or a little guy in one of our classrooms that is looking for attention, so he stuck his foot out and a child tripped and hurt themselves. It's this impulsivity, this negative seeking behavior, and the conflict seeking behavior we talked about just a little while ago. So they enjoy conflict. Children with ADHD are intense, and they want you intense with them. So we'll talk about that a little later.
And oftentimes it's not a malicious thing. They're trying to wake their brain up. So I have this wonderful, when I was a teacher, I had this wonderful little boy named Jimmy. And then I had this other wonderful little girl named Susie who had these beautiful braids. And Jimmy would sit next to Susie and pull on her braids. And no matter how much I said, you don't pull on Susie's braids, he was pulling on the braids. Because Susie would scream and he'd go, oh, and then he could pay attention. So this conflict-seeking behavior can cause a lot of social issues.
Yes.
And so sometimes you'll see that. We brought in a new term in the slide called executive dysfunction. So we're going to go into what that means and how that executive function relates to ADHD. Because it's happening in the same part of the brain. When we look at that brain picture again, with the frontal lobe having holes in it because it's a lack of absorption of neurochemicals, well, that area of the brain, that frontal lobe, prefrontal cortex, is also very responsible for things that make us be good students, being able to inhibit impulses, being able to sustain attention, being able to organize, being able to plan and self-monitor. And so our executive functions and ADHD go hand in hand. So the other thing that is important to know is when we talked about the brain, areas of the brain and the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure centers in the center of our brain, and I have parents who will say, well, they can pay attention to video games all day long, but they can't do their math page. There's a difference. There's an internal motivation, or you can draw or play with Legos for hours and hours and hours. That's an internal drive where our nucleus accumbens and our pleasure centers are like, oh, I love this, I love this, I love this. But school and teacher directions and chores are all an external demand. So when a teacher, parent, other peer is talking to you, that information is going right to the frontal lobes. And the frontal lobe has to say, this is important and I need to do this, or I need to pay attention to this. Versus when they're doing something they love, they don't have an external demand. It's all internally driven. It's all internal motivation.
I have a good example of that. We were camping with our elementary children, and I had two little boys bunking who both had ADHD. And the one little boy was reading a book, and he was so happy reading and reading and reading. And the other boy with ADHD is jumping on the bed. And he looked over and he said, why are you reading? And he looked at him and said, why are you jumping on the bed? And he said, it makes me happy, yes. Right? So that feeling of I'm really enjoying this, yes, is important to understand. And then when it was time to get organized to get on the hike, they didn't have their backpacks, their flashlights. They didn't know where their shoes were.
One was the inattentive type, just like in their own world was hyperactive, impulsive. That's a great example.
Exactly.
Great example. ADHD, that frontal lobe, is a developmental delay. It's also a delay in executive functions. And there tends to be about a 30% delay. So this is you're going to have this in your packet. It's kind of hard to read, but it's a great way to see that a child's chronological age may not be their frontal lobe age, and that meeting the child where they're at developmentally is really important, because you can't expect a 9-year-old with a frontal lobe that's like a 6-year-old to be able to do the same kinds of things.
And so when you're looking at a 30% decrease in maturity and executive function.
Absolutely. So they may be actually very mature in other ways, but from those frontal lobe functions, planning, organizing, self-monitoring, sustaining focus for periods of time, being able to inhibit impulses, there's about a 30% delay. So again, if you're 9, you're in an upper elementary classroom.
Lower still.
Oh, 9.
You're 6 to 9, 10 to, yeah.
Those may be those 6-year-olds where they're playing with the 6-year-old.
Yes, so that you're seeking out peers that are younger as well.
Because they enjoy the same kinds of things. They're more impulsive, so that it doesn't bother them as much as it would bother a peer of a 9-year-old age. And so that 30% delay is so important for educators to know, because your expectations have to be realistic. Yeah. The other thing that teachers sometimes say is, well, yesterday they had this phenomenal day. I didn't have to do anything. And today they're a mess. Well, I wish that neurochemistry was consistently absorbed every day in our brains, and it's not. I mean, we have off days, right? Yes. Where we're not functioning as well as other days. And that's the same with everybody. Now, a child with a neurochemical dysregulation is going to have this kind of bouncing from day to day. Maybe it's a good day, maybe it's a bad day, maybe it's a good day, and then there's other factors that come into play too.
If they're tired, if they're hungry, if they're not getting along with someone. And then that goes back to the observation in the Montessori classroom over a 6-week period. And being able to look at when there were on days, what came together for that child, but understanding that there is inconsistency, and that can be confusing for teachers and parents as well. So when you're looking at criteria, you're looking at 6 out of 9 of the criteria.
Yep. And that the executive functions, that frontal lobe of our brain, also interacts with other areas where language processing and visual processing and sensory processing and emotional processing all has to come together. And our frontal lobe says, what do I do with this information? So we kind of think about the frontal lobe as a conductor of the rest of the brain. It's the boss of our brain. And it helps us activate, and it helps us focus, and it helps us maintain and sustain effort and regulate emotions and memory. It brings up memories, like what do I need to retrieve in this situation? And then it either puts us into action or it stops our action. So our frontal lobe is an extremely important, it's what makes us human.
So we covered a lot in this conversation, and hopefully you're taking some notes at home and looking at the child with their brain and looking at children that have the ADHD brain model, that it's an absorption of chemicals that's not happening, and that this part of the brain is where the problem is. It's that child that is having trouble planning, organizing. And in a Montessori environment, we trust the Montessori philosophy, we trust our teaching, our pedagogy, we trust that the child is going to grow and develop, but we're also realistic in saying there's something going on with this child.
And really, what's normal? Right? That's so important about what's normal. So as a teacher, what should we be expecting from a typical, neurotypical 3-year-old versus maybe a 3-year-old with ADHD?
And we'll use that term in our next video, neurotypical or typical development, brain development. And that refers to kind of a bell curve.
Yeah,
right?
about 50% of the population, and then you have students who may be on the higher end and then on the lower end. It's a spectrum.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Alicia. So we'll wrap this up and we will see you in just a bit for our next video.